Okay, so my first question, you're doing UX in an agile way. Tell me a little bit more about what it means.
Yeah, I remember I wrote this in some biography or profile.
Mm-hmm.
Agile for me, what first interests me about it is this notion of collaboration
Mm-hmm.
and the emphasis on creating something, on actually making something rather than producing deliverables. So that's what attracted me about Agile in the first place. And for me, it's a mindset about this, for me, about inclusive collaboration and not a methodology. So when you mention Agile, often someone says Scrum or XP is some other methodology, but without the mindset, that won't work.
Mm-hmm.
Agile has become mainstream now, with latest trends like Lean Startup coming up, and Agile can still be very development-driven and execution-focused, and that can cause issues for design thinking. So what excites me right now, and that for me came from discussing Agile with people who started to do it from the design community, is that notion of a balanced team where you have Agile with development, there's design, and product management, and they all work together with that collaborative mindset. And for me, this can create opportunities for research. So when I say I do UX in an agile way, for me, that's this underlying philosophy of cutting corner and collaborating with others.
All right. So when it comes to UX research, how does it work in an agile environment?
I looked into this from I started a few years ago, observing people, interviewing people, reading papers on how people do that in an agile environment. And I have to say it depends. Mm-hmm. I've looked into different contexts from people in startups to really large organizations who are adopting Agile, and there's several best practices and approaches to do it. So there's case studies where people try to do, for example, 5 users every Friday. So schedule research in as often as you can, make it a habit, and then do lightweight reporting, do quick iterations. So kind of move away from reporting research findings in long PowerPoint and do something more engaging. I've also seen research tracks where there's an agile team with designers who focus on actually production of it, with researchers in a separate track or even separate innovation tracks. That can cause issues for the team. It can make designers very disconnected from the research findings, for example. So I've also seen people working in parallel tracks or designers to pair up to allow them to test their designs. So I think it is still a challenge at the moment. There's certain qualities that let methods work well in an agile context. So being iterative, being continuous, and being very collaborative. So I think the best examples that I've seen for making research work is actually people who opened up the process and realized, okay, to move that fast, we don't have enough designers or researchers on the project. So let's try to help whoever's interested in our team help us with the research.
Mm-hmm. So when I ask UX people who practice user research, what is their biggest challenge? I often hear how hard it is to engage stakeholders such as engineers, product managers, and executives with user research. What are your thoughts on this challenge?
I often get this question, and for me the answer is people know from the marketing background about focus groups, for example, about getting customer feedback. Mm-hmm. But many of the things that when we describe these experience techniques, we still use a lot of buzzwords. So it's often hard to convince people by words, and you can't expect them to get quickly where you are. It's about meeting them where they are. Mm-hmm. So I think you have to prove the value by doing, by finding allies. But most importantly, look at what your stakeholders' problems are. What are their concerns? What are their questions? So UX people are often very good at empathy, at observing others and seeing what they need, giving a presentation in a room and understanding what does my audience want to hear. Mm-hmm. And that's a skill that I found really useful with listening to stakeholders, winning their trust, and addressing their pain points. Because in the end, everybody wants to be a hero, especially in large organizations. Everybody likes to have the answers. Mm-hmm. And if research addresses people's concerns, moves them forward, and gives them stories to tell, this is when they will have their moments of success by the work that the research gave them. So most of it is, again, collaboration and involving people in the process and really finding out what's in their heads and what are the right questions that they need answered and how can you help them.
Can you tell me a story about a difficult stakeholder who is maybe not understanding or respecting UX research?
Yeah, I thought a little bit about that, like if I met someone who's like super difficult. And for me, a challenge was when I was working in a very large organization that people didn't question the value of customer input, but they came from a product management or marketing background. So I remember a stakeholder who wanted to get input and who wanted to have customers help him kind of make decisions about what to do next. And when he came to us, it was more like, let's do a focus group. Mm-hmm. And it took a while to actually understand, okay, pull him back and say, good, so what are actually your questions? So we involved him in the planning of research in that stage, that we were like, okay, step back. What are the answers that we want to have? And why would we then looked at the stuff we had from him and from other people in the business who were interested in research and said, well, there are things that a focus group or some surveys that they're used to could answer. But there are so many things that we can't address. For example, understanding people's mental model about the core concept of the whole product mm-hmm. that people wouldn't describe in a focus group. So in that case, we wanted to suggest some tangible features techniques, for example, designing the box. And to get people excited about how that could work, ideally you would get them and do a little exercise with them to show them, hey, this is the research technique we have in mind that could work. There's not always the time for that, I understand, or some people aren't interested, won't come to your design of the box or whatever else exercise you do. In that example, we showed them from previous projects we had done what the outcome could be, and then kind of did a little bit of, there were elements that they were comfortable with, more of a focus group approach, but we got other things into the mix. And instead of hiring one of the market research agencies that they had been using before, we could convince them to use an agency. And what was core was that also we knew the people in the agency well who helped us conduct the research. Mm-hmm. And one important part to make the case study, I guess, successful was we made our stakeholders come along and engage them in these sessions, so they weren't falling asleep in a dark usability lab. Mm-hmm. And it was different to observing other focus group style sessions. We gave them post-its to record, to have collaborative note-taking. After every session, the researcher conducting the sessions came in and we quickly did some analysis together. So they were really excited that they could see progress and they could have input on what was going on. But also in the end, how the findings were presented was a big success for them. They loved that they actually had physical artifacts that the research participants had produced that they could then display in the office, and people walked by and got more interested in the whole project. Mm-hmm.
So startups usually, or many startups now, try to work agile. And something makes me feel that startups and UX research are almost always not going hand in hand. And again, I might be wrong here, but the basic notion of startup founders is that we know what people need. And on the other hand, UX researchers' notion is we have no idea what people need, let's find out. What are your thoughts on this?
So the notion of just from going to events where there are people from startups, not necessarily lean startups, but startups in general, and suddenly saying, hey, I'm a designer, I do research, I'm here. I was often the only person there. And I've seen an interest But similar to engaging difficult stakeholders, I found that user experience research and how we talk about it is still something that's very hard to grasp. Because it is a set of tools and methods. It's not a process that you can just follow. So if you do it for the first time, it is quite hard, and I see a bit of a barrier. So on a more of an evaluation level, not where the big ideas come from, but just to go as we build our product quickly, I had lots of questions about how can we do it quickly? How can we save money? What's the right way to do it? And I see that there's a huge opportunity to share knowledge of things that the user experience community has tried and materials out there about not asking leading questions, about making the right research choices, about doing remote testing and how that comes in the mix of triangulation, where startups are very willing to learn from us. But at this moment in time, I feel there aren't enough UX people engaging who could actually recommend, hey, this is how you do it, because you need a certain level of experience. And some of the startup questions are very specific and very hard to answer sometimes. What I see from the lean startup trend currently coming up is this notion of customer development and how could that go hand in hand with UX research methods. So customer development is a process in the beginning where you want to validate your business model, your idea really quickly, get it out there, and actually see, is there a market for this? Is it worth pursuing that? Or should we very quickly pursue a completely different idea? And one question that often comes from startups is, how can I validate my idea even if there is no prototype yet? If I haven't built anything, how do I do that beforehand? And there are UX techniques and ideas, things that you can do that goes from interviews and conducting interviews in the right way, which can be quite hard, having observations in the real world with your ideas in mind and your business model idea in mind, to doing things like design the box exercises or body storming or the game storming techniques. It's more about exposing people to a future scenario or a big Wizard of Oz where I'm acting out my product or service idea to you as I was a system. So the system doesn't exist. I could just let you have the experience and see how you reacted. So I think there are opportunities, but it's still hard to get your head around a set of practices. And there's still the notion that, any kind of research is big up front, which is often frowned upon and not really about iterating, getting things out there very quickly. But I think that UXs are becoming more flexible, and we're seeing approaches where people try to make sure that their research approach makes sense rather than following a book.
Imagine an in-house UX researcher who's always trying to identify opportunities for impactful research. What would you recommend they should do to better identify such opportunities?
Leave your design or research corner, collaborate and engage. The most important thing I think here is finding allies and finding out who else in my organization cares about customer feedback, who else is there collecting data, who is there to actually identify problems, opportunities in the marketing team, for example, in the development team, and how can I engage with them. One of my colleagues, when I worked in a very large organization, he was just a perfect networker, and all the information was coming to him. He managed to get so many research projects just by being the friendly guy who walked around the office, who chatted to people and just asked what was going on. So I think that is a really good quality, and building these relationships when you're in-house, it can take a while. It can be really a steep curve, and you have to invest a lot. But it will pay off in the end to be the kind of go-to person who can help.
Last question. And some people tell me that this is the hardest one. How can UX practitioners tell if their stakeholders are bought into research?
For me, it's about the stories that they share afterwards with others. Maybe it's a nugget when you engage them in observing some research, or maybe it is a really, really good deliverable that you put together. So for an example is we had a research session and there were people engaged, they had all deep insights, but we brought it together in an infographic that should give people an overview and make them look up the other materials that we had or talk to people. And this suddenly started appearing on people's desks, but not in the kind of drawer where nothing is that all these papers that you never look at. It was actually up on people's walls. And people who didn't have a wall, I saw a few people actually sticking these research findings up on their monitor and using a little laptop so they could look at it. So that was really, really good, I think. But obviously, especially in an agile way, it has to be actionable. In an agile context, often research comes up with either ideas or suggestions for priorities or usability issues that need to be fixed. And sometimes they go into a backlog and die there. But ideally, they should be actionable. So for me, the best way to actually tell if they bought into research is if I can see the research in the end somehow manifesting in the product. If it is problems get fixed, or if it's we had this great idea that came out from research or this insight that changed the way we did things. That's the ultimate, I think.
All right. That's it then.